Good afternoon. My name is Bob Shapiro. I'm the editor of Political Science Quarterly and the president of the Academy of Political Science. I want to welcome members of the Academy and other guests to our quarterly Academy Forum, in which we are going to be showcasing articles from recent editions of Political Science Quarterly. And today we have the pleasure of having Deborah Larson speak about her recent article hot off the press called Policy or Pique, Trump and the Turn to Great Power Competition. I want to introduce our speakers, but first I want to alert the audience that if you have questions, please type them in to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. I'll click on it, and then I'll field the questions to the speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Our lead speaker is Deborah Welch Larson, who's a professor of political science at UCLA. Her research concerns American foreign policy and the role of status seeking in international relations. Her spring 2021 PSQ article builds on her recent book with Alexei Shevchenko. The book's entitled Quest for Status, Chinese and Russian Foreign Policy. And I have particularly great pleasure of introducing my esteemed colleague, Professor Robert Jervis, who's the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Affairs at Columbia University, specializing in international politics in general and security policy and decision-making and theories of conflict and cooperation in particular. Professor Jervis serves on the Political Science Quarterly's editorial board. His latest book is How Statesmen Think, The Psychology of International Politics. And without further ado, Professor Larson.
Thank you, Bob. And greetings to Bob, the other Bob Jervis, whom I haven't seen for some time. It's great to be with you virtually. Since 2017, the US strategy towards China and Russia has been one of great power competition. The United States opposes China's and Russia's efforts to increase their influence and their military activities in the gray zone. Trump's policy towards China and Russia is a continuation of trends that began in the Obama administration. The United States is reacting to increased assertiveness by both China and Russia in the South China Sea and in Ukraine and Syria. But in the article, I argue that Trump's personalization of foreign policy made relations much worse. It undermined US credibility and leverage and overall increased tensions. By 2020, relations with China had become so bad that there were references to a new Cold War. US relations with China were worse than at any time since 1978, when Deng Xiaoping started his opening up policy. In the case of Russia, Russian fighter jets were intercepting US planes near Alaska, the Mediterranean, and the Black Sea. So today, I'm first going to talk about Trump's personalization of foreign relations. And then I'm going to discuss his conduct of the trade war with China and his policy towards Russia. And then at the end, I'm going to briefly predict how President Joe Biden will handle the policy of great power competition. So first, with personal diplomacy. Other presidents have used personal diplomacy, like Franklin D. Roosevelt, but Trump viewed foreign relations through the lens of his personal relationship with their leaders. If he had good personal relations with the leader, if he had a sense of rapport, he inferred that relations with the state were good, regardless of whether the other state was carrying out hostile actions against US interests. He sometimes made unilateral concessions to other leaders to ingratiate himself, thinking that eventually they would return the favor, just as if they were another real estate mogul or something. Trump also didn't want to criticize the actions of China or Russia publicly because he didn't want to upset his personal relationships with Xi Jinping and Putin. This applied also to China, even when he was conducting a trade war. Trump had campaigned against China's trade practices. He accused them of ripping us off. But in his first year in office, Trump didn't do anything. In fact, he tried to build a personal friendship with Xi Jinping. He wanted China to help the US restrain North Korea, and he thought that maybe Xi might help reduce the US trade deficit with China. But eventually relations with North Korea were on more of an even keel thanks to the summit, and the negotiations with China didn't really go anywhere on the trade deficit. So in July 2018, Trump launched the trade war with 25% tariffs on $50 billion of Chinese exports to the United States. To everyone's great surprise, China retaliated with tariffs on US soybeans, pork, automobiles, which were designed to hurt Midwestern states that had helped elect Trump to the presidency. Angry at China's nerve in retaliating, Trump announced that he was going to impose tariffs of $200 billion worth of Chinese products, with more to come. The US Special Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, was an experienced trade negotiator. He wanted to get the Chinese to make concessions on structural issues like the subsidies they provided to Chinese firms, which allowed them to undercut US firms on prices, or their theft of US intellectual property. The tariffs were supposed to provide leverage to get the Chinese to make concessions. They were like an economic version of coercive diplomacy. He gave the Chinese deadlines. They would have to make concessions by such and such a time, or else he would impose even more tariffs. Trump was impatient for results. But what the United States was asking of China was not trivial. The United States was asking China, or demanding that China change its economic model, which would involve altering domestic laws, and basically part of the reason for their great success. It's noteworthy that Trump wanted the Chinese to make these big changes in their domestic system, and the Chinese are very sensitive about sovereignty. Now, at the same time that Trump was conducting this trade war against China, he made unilateral concessions to Xi Jinping on the Chinese telecommunication firms, ZTE and Huawei. The Commerce Department had imposed penalties on ZTE because they sold massive amounts of equipment to North Korea and Iran in violation of US sanctions. Under the penalties, ZTE would be prohibited from buying US computer chips, which would put them out of business. But Trump lifted the ban in response to a personal phone call from Xi Jinping, who said he would owe Trump a favor. So clearly, he knew how Trump thought. Similarly, the US Commerce Department placed Huawei on the special entities list, which would prohibit them from buying US semiconductors, which they needed for their mobile phones. If the sanctions remained in place, Huawei could theoretically go out of business. But again, Trump responded to a plea from Xi Jinping and agreed that the sanctions didn't have to be applied in full immediately. There could be loopholes. Both ZTE and Huawei were national security issues. In the case of Huawei, US officials were concerned that it could use its control of 5G networks for espionage against the United States and its allies. The fact that Trump made concessions on national security issues and the US legal system showed that anything was negotiable. That Trump would give concessions on anything, regardless of what he said. And that reduced US leverage. Ultimately, Trump revealed his true priorities in the trade talks. He wanted China to buy more US products so that he could claim a victory in his re-election campaign. At the Osaka summit in Japan in June 2019, Trump pleaded with Xi Jinping to buy more US farm products, more soybeans and wheat, so that he could be reelected. Now, of course, this undercut Lighthizer, who was trying to get concessions from China on protection of intellectual property and subsidies to Chinese industry. It showed that basically all Trump cared about was farm products. In the end, Trump got impatient and he wanted a deal no matter what by 2020 so he could campaign on it. In December 2019, Trump settled for a so-called Phase 1 agreement in which the Chinese promised to buy more exports and more US farm products. But even at the time, trade analysts predicted that the Chinese would not meet these targets. They were highly unrealistic. And this was even before the pandemic. So they did not reach the targets in buying US products. And the agreement said nothing about the structural issues of Chinese subsidies and their theft of intellectual property. And the agreement left in place the tariffs that Trump had imposed on $360 billion worth of Chinese products, which are paid for by the US consumer. Now, US relations with Russia were different because there were no ongoing major negotiations, no attempts to reach a big deal. And that isn't because Trump didn't want a big deal. In fact, Trump wanted better relations with Putin, who he had long admired. And Trump thought it might be possible. In fact, it would be a good thing to cooperate with Russia on issues like Syria, North Korea, and Ukraine. The Russians hoped for a grand bargain. Trump met with Putin twice. Once at the outskirts of the G20 meeting in Hamburg in 2017, and again in July 2018 at Helsinki. At Hamburg in 2017, Trump got along very well with Putin. They talked much longer than was scheduled, and Trump showed unaccustomed humility and deference towards Putin. He declined to confront Putin over accusations that the Russians had interfered in the 2016 elections. But Trump's show of deference to Putin backfired at home politically. His relations with Putin were toxic. Angered and concerned by Trump's obsequiousness towards Putin, the US Congress passed sanctions in August 2017. And these sanctions would require Trump to show that the Russians had changed their behavior, which was responsible for the sanctions in the first place. The sanctions were much worse than those imposed by Obama, which could be lifted by executive order. And then Trump's first and only formal summit with Putin in July 2018 was a public relations fiasco. Trump, as is well known, sided with Putin over his own intelligence agencies over whether Russians had interfered in the 2016 election. This aroused a storm of criticism in the United States, even from Republicans who never criticized Trump. So it became dangerous politically for Trump to meet with Putin, and his advisors wanted him to basically stay away from Russia. Ironically, Trump's friendship with Putin made it impossible for him to get anything done politically in the form of some kind of substantive agreement. Without arms control negotiations, there was nothing for the United States and Russia to talk about, really. But Trump wanted to have more and better and more advanced nuclear weapons than any other state, including Russia. So there were no negotiations on arms control. But arms control was extremely important to Russia and still is. It's the one issue on which Russia is an equal to the US. But instead of having negotiations, in 2019, Trump withdrew from the INF Treaty. And the only major arms control agreement that was still in effect was New START, which was set to expire in February 2021. Putin offered to renew the agreement with President Trump in December 2019, but Trump declined, even though it would have been easy to do, because he wanted China to be involved, which was not going to happen. So relations with both China and Russia spiraled down even worse after COVID-19. Initially, Trump praised Xi Jinping repeatedly for his handling of the virus. As late as March 27, Trump tweeted, "We are working closely together. Much respect." But when Trump realized that COVID-19 was not going to go away on its own and that it was going to harm the US economy on which he was counting for his reelection, Trump started blaming China for the virus. Allowing personal interest to influence foreign policy can lead to inconsistency and abrupt changes, and that's what happened. Because of his interest in being reelected, Trump allowed China hawks in his administration free rein, although he had told Xi privately that he didn't care if the Chinese put Muslims in concentration camps, and he didn't care if the Chinese cracked down on the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. Now, the US imposed sanctions on Chinese officials for human rights abuses. In July 2020, 4 high-level US officials, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, Attorney General Bill Barr, and FBI Director Christopher Wray, all made speeches attacking China for expansionism, for promoting its ideology abroad, and for espionage. Pompeo, at the Nixon Library, which was important symbolically, said that blind engagement had failed, and unless the United States created an anti-China coalition, our children would be under Chinese domination. The China hawks defined US relations with China in terms of ideology, which was very reminiscent of the US-Soviet Cold War and made it difficult to cooperate. So how is President Joe Biden going to change things? Well, there's substantial elements of continuity in Biden's policy towards China and Russia. Interestingly, Biden shares with Trump an interest in personal diplomacy. As vice president and as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he had met with foreign leaders many times, including Xi Jinping and Putin. But Biden differs from Trump in not viewing US relations with Russia and China in terms of his personal relationships with these leaders. Biden uses face-to-face negotiations as a way of sizing up the other side, finding out their interest, maybe their weak spots. Biden doesn't think he can charm foreign leaders into making concessions that are against their interest. Biden regards US relations with both China and Russia as competitive. But he believes that the United States can still cooperate on issues of common concern, like the environment in Afghanistan. In order to compete with China, Biden thinks that the United States has to improve its economy and has to show that democracy works. Instead of pressuring China on trade, Biden wants to invest more in the technologies of the future, 5G, artificial intelligence, electric cars, and so forth. To Russia, Biden has offered the status incentive of a summit meeting with Putin, along with sanctions in retaliation for Russian election interference and the hacking. Now, the Russians retaliated against the sanctions tit for tat, but they're talking with Biden about the summit meeting. And it's noteworthy that Putin recently pulled back Russian troops from the border with Ukraine. So the combination of carrots and sticks seems to be working. So in conclusion, I would say that personal relations between leaders and personal diplomacy need not have negative consequences, as long as the effort is made to reach agreements that are in both sides' mutual interest. The problem with Trump's personal diplomacy is that personal relations were everything. So, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Larson, and especially for the update on and comparison with the Biden administration. And now comments from Professor Jervis.
Thank you, Debbie. Great to see you, even if only virtually, and the members of the Academy. It's a great topic and a marvelous presentation. Let me take about 10 or 15 minutes to pick up on several of your themes. The main one, of course, is the prevalence and importance of forms, and I stress forms in the plural, of personalized diplomacy. I agree completely with what you said, that on the one hand, Trump was not unusual in thinking his personal relations with his counterparts mattered. I'll come back to that in a minute. But on the other hand, he both took it to extremes and did it in very odd ways. But first, let me stress what you said, but draw a contrast that most of the academic literature on certainly bargaining and general international politics downplays or even dismisses the personal relations among either the top leaders or the negotiators. That, as we know, that the field of world negotiation in the broad sense, heavily influenced by the discipline of economics, not only rational actor mode, but sort of standard bargaining models that we could go through, and those do not include much room for, if you will, personal chemistry. Tends to be dismissed as at most window dressing, self-delusions, and superficial. But I've never served in the government, but a lot of my friends and former students, categories that I hope overlap, have. And, you know, I've talked to them quite a bit, and all of us, the universities, have speakers from the government or former government come up, both in public contexts and ones that are more candid. And without exception, and I really do mean that they all, everyone, to a person, some of them are women, mostly men, insist that, but not only the relations between, say, at the very top, but the relations of the people sitting around the table matter. Do they determine? No. But do they matter? Yes. That, and at the margin, big margin, can produce success or failure. I had discussion with friends of mine who were involved in the Iran negotiations for the JCPOA, and they stressed that the Kerry-Zarif interactions were really very important. Not that they became buddies, although they, I think, was a real degree of friendship formed, but that their two styles meshed, often in ways like a family. That is, they yelled at each other. There were times when someone had to come in from outside, from the corridor, and say, "Gentlemen, I have to tell you that everyone outside can hear you screaming at each other. So maybe you want to take a break." It isn't as though they went easy, but the ways in which they argued and displayed emotion were compatible, whereas this would not necessarily have been true for, say, Zarif and Hillary Clinton, or perhaps Kerry and another Iranian leader. And they developed also a degree of trust, not in the sense of believing everything, but feeling that they were not likely to be lied to or diddled with. And other negotiators, I've not talked to either Zarif or Kerry. I've talked to negotiators at lower levels and other things. And this is a theme that comes up time and time again. So and yet it's really, I think, not recognized in most, I shouldn't say academic, in political science writings. I think historians, less influenced, probably economists, would give it a larger role. Now, of course, it is different or exaggerated, perhaps, relations among leaders. And I like very much Debbie's mention of Franklin Roosevelt, because as she knows even better than I, Roosevelt, on the one hand, was a real appreciator of hardcore, if you will, realist values and determinants of foreign policy. But like many leaders, Roosevelt was very confident of, first, his ability to size up his opposite number, and his ability to convince his opposite number of his, FDR's, sincerity, goodwill, and also ability to be tough. And so Roosevelt was very, very anxious to meet Stalin, and made sure, in fact, that he saw Stalin alone before the meeting of the big three, that is, with Churchill, because he was convinced that he could, as Roosevelt put it, get to Stalin, get in the sense of understand Stalin and reach him. We can debate whether that was true, as with most of these. There's something to it, but exaggerated. But for, I think, Roosevelt, this was a very calculated, maybe miscalculated view, an estimate of his own abilities, of how people behaved. I think for Trump, it was much more a reflection of ego. I mean, Roosevelt's not without ego. No president or leader is. And they generally have these very flattering self-images. But I don't think for FDR, this was a compensation for personal insecurities or weaknesses. I think for Trump, it is. I mean, partly, as Debbie said, his background as, heaven forbid, a New York real estate wheeler and dealer, thinking that the way he could deal with the local union bosses was the way to deal with Xi and Putin. Partly, I think, again, much more than FDR and more than Biden. And I agree, Biden loves to press the flesh, right? They're both, in that way, Biden is a real retail politician. But for Trump, I think having the opposite numbers think well of him, or say they did, was a way of inflating or keep his ego, a way of affirming the fact that he was really not only a competent, but a great leader. And he also believed, I think, in very superficial mirror imaging, that the same sort, that other leaders would respond to those same incentives, that they would react very favorably to affirmations of their role in the world and what great leaders they were, without understanding that these people were very different than Trump. I mean, New York real estate is a tough neighborhood, but right, not quite as tough as the one that Putin and grew up in. The ends of the realm are quite different. These people were much more skilled, much more self-aware, I believe. So this was really a bizarre period in, I think, American history. Also went along, and Debbie, I think, has hinted at this, but I want to stress it. The personalization in the American policy went along with an unusual degree of incompetence and incoherence in the American policy. I want to be a little careful. It's very easy for academics to think that they're smarter than the presidents or secretaries of state. We've studied this all our lives. We know how to do this, yada, yada, yada. All that I think is generally wrong. It's also easy to be swayed by one's personal preferences, and I doubt if I will disclose secrets by saying that I was not a fan of Trump's and thought that opposed his election and thought and think the presidency was a disaster. And we have to be careful that our preferences don't bleed over into our analyses of what happened. But I think it's fair to say that because of part of the personalization, Trump missed the poli-sci 101, personnel is policy. Who you appoint to your leading positions makes an enormous difference in the policy. And with some exceptions, Trump did not appoint people in the area of Russia and China, as opposed to immigration. He did not appoint people who agreed with him. I mean, he wanted better relations with Putin. So maybe Tillerson did, but Tillerson, was just a zero. But certainly it was clear Pompeo didn't want that. McMaster wrote the era of great power competition, national security document. He didn't believe we could get better relations with Putin, at least not by being nice to Putin. Neither did Bolton, obviously, believe the reverse. So you had Trump saying one thing, but his top people, not the deep state, his top political appointees having a very different view. And you even saw this somewhat in China, where after Trump turned, there was an agreement on, if you will, I don't want to add it, a tough on China policy. But as Debbie has said, the reasons for this were really quite different. Trump focused on the bilateral trade balance, which most economists would tell us is meaningless, partly the way it's computed, all sorts of things to go into in the Q&A, but let me put that aside. That whereas even his own appointees felt it wasn't so much the balance, but as Debbie said, the very structure of the Chinese economy incompatible with basic rules of liberal and fair trading, so that they cared more about restructuring. Trump cared mostly on the bottom line of the trade deficit. And on the third hand, the people on the NSC cared about the South China Sea and the conflicts with North Korea, conflict with Japan over the Senkakus, the strategic issues posed by the rise of China. So, these three issues, the trade balance, the structure of the Chinese economy, Chinese foreign policy, these are all different, and you got to pick your targets. And the US government didn't, rather each person or group picked its own target. And that led to a degree of incoherence. Ironically, most economists, I think, agree that the policy that Xi is following of return to state control of most of the economy in the long run will cripple China. Just doesn't work. And it will weaken the country, its economy, its foreign policy. And so ironically, if we pressured China to reform, it would strengthen Chinese growth and make China a more able international competitor. Well, maybe that would be a price worth paying, but these sort of contradictions were never, I think, fully faced. So where does this leave us for Biden? A couple of things. First, the Biden policy will be much more coherent. It really is a team. These people have worked together for years. They know each other. I mean, these people in the top positions in the state, defense, the intelligence community, the NSC, they worked together under Obama. Then they had the 4 years in the wilderness, sharing the offices in the Washington think tanks. They can complete each other's sentences. This is good and bad. I mean, good in that, for the team to know how everyone else thinks is an enormous asset. It will allow them to work together. On the other hand, it may induce a degree of conformity, that it may be harder for outside views, iconoclasm from the right or the left, to get a hearing. They may be too not intolerant of opposing views. I know some of these people at the second and third levels and know of the top. I think they are generally quite tolerant people, but you get an atmosphere. Everyone believes X, we don't have to go back and re-examine it. But there will be a degree of I think, of coherence there. Second, and more perhaps of a surprise, they may be willing to be bolder than is usual in foreign policy. I mean, taking chances in foreign policy is a chancy thing. And, it can lead to defeats in elections, can't get you elected, but it can get you defeated. And Biden, of course, has spent his whole career in government, a lot of it in foreign policy, without, I think, evolving a very strong ideology or outlook. But it has given him a degree of self-confidence. And I'm struck by the decision to unconditionally withdraw in Afghanistan. No argue whether good or bad, both. But two things are really striking. One is the decision did not leak ahead of time. I mean, the government, about 2 days before the official announcement, the people in the government fanned out, told the press what was coming. But that wasn't a leak. That was, sort of, they're in effect releasing it. But, there were no stories ahead of time that they were on the verge of doing this. There's no stories I saw, no discussion of the fight. And obviously there was. The military didn't want to do this. The IC was at least cautious. Nothing leaked, which is really quite astounding. And it really was quite bold. Biden, I think, having learned or mislearned, we can argue about that, from Obama's experience, I didn't hesitate to override the military. In a situation where there wasn't a lot of domestic pressure, there wasn't pressure to pull out all the troops. There are almost no casualties. Public opinion pays no attention. So it was very, very bold in overruling the military in a way when if Afghanistan turns into even more of a disaster, he'll be blamed. So I think that was really quite interesting, and maybe for the way he'd behave in the future. Finally, and on the general relations with China and Russia, Debbie mentioned in passing something I agree with, but I want to put a question mark in some, that Russia and China in the 40 years under Trump had been increasingly assertive. I think that's true. Some accounts, again, blame or attribute this to the personal views and politics of Putin and Xi, argue that there was a sharp turn to more assertiveness, more anti-American, when Putin took control back from Medvedev, and when Xi took over and asserted his really complete control of China's domestic and foreign policy. I'm not sure that's right. I'm not an expert on either Russia or China. I've read the accounts that say there's more continuity there than the view focusing on the leaders would lead one to believe. Furthermore, the US is not only sinned against, I think it is a sinner. That is, the US has been competing pretty damn hard all along. And I just want to mention two quite different aspects. One on the cyber area where we expelled a number of Russian diplomats and sanctioned a number of Russians for the SolarWinds hack. And we often called that an attack. Well, SolarWinds was not really an attack. It was a large-scale, very successful instance of espionage. And espionage now by cyber is been common for, well, depending how we define cyber, 10, 20 years. The US has done enormous cyber espionage operations against Russia, China, Iran, other countries. Tends not to publicize this, but we're very, very active. What Russia did was really quite successful, startling, needs to be defended against, but it wasn't, if you will, a breaking of the rule of the game. It wasn't very different from stuff the US had done. And indeed, Putin could see it as retaliation for things the US had done. And on China, perhaps, the really big question for the coming decade. It's certainly true that China has been more assertive in its neighborhood. But I would just ask, under what theory of international relations would we expect the power balance between two major countries to change significantly, as it has between the US and China, thanks to the Chinese economic growth, and not to have some significant adjustment of relations? That is, under what theory would we expect China to go from a very poor to a fairly rich and quite powerful country without demanding and getting some significant changes in relations in its neighborhood? So, yes, the US is reacting, but it also is acting. And although I think it will act in a good deal steadier fashion in the coming years under Biden, especially because several of the leading people in the administration are Columbia PhDs. Thank you.
Thank you for the excellent comments. Okay. I have a number of questions from the audience lined up, and I'd encourage audience members to submit some additional questions. But I just want to ask Professor Larson, do you have anything further you want to say in response to what Professor Jervis has said, or should I just go to the questions?
No, I think go ahead and open it up to questions.
Okay, so I'm going to ask. There are just a bunch of pointed ones that I think you can answer pretty briefly. So, in your conception of the emphasis on Trump's personal interests, did Trump's business interests in China and Russia fit in with this at all?
No.
No. Okay.
No.
Okay. I'll take that. Another pointed one. Do you view, and this is for either of you can comment on this. So Bob, if you want to chime in on the other one, do so. You view President Trump's trade policy reminiscent of American isolationism of the post-World War I era?
No, because we're thickly enmeshed with China right now, despite the trade war. The iPhones are manufactured in China, and that's one of the difficulties. We're so entangled with them that it's very hard for us to, well, it would be disastrous for the United States to decouple itself completely from China. So despite Trump's withdrawal, we're still enmeshed in the international economy. So it's not comparable.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Bob.
I agree, except I think there is a flavor of the greater, trade as a zero-sum relationship, which is crazy, of course. You don't have to be a free market economist to think that trade is a positive sum relationship with areas of conflict, but largely mutual gains to be had. But Trump's focus on what he considered the bottom line, the bilateral deficit or surplus, I think that had some echoes of the 1930s nationalism reaction to the Depression.
Okay. Now, Bob, I think you were clear on this, but here's this is just a further clarification. In light of Professor Jervis's comments on Trump's personalization of American foreign policy, did it actually help or hurt his goals, or did the people he appointed in key positions thwart his aims?
Well, I think, and I'm interested to hear what Debbie says, that they ended up, many of them, thwarting his goals, and maybe eventually we'll learn if this was sort of conscious or not. I mean, you read Bolton's book, and it's clear where he tries to pull Trump back, it would be the polite way, if not undercut him on things like withdrawing from NATO. Now, I agree with Bolton and disagree with Trump, but still, that it's clear that if Bolton's account is right, no reason to deny it, that Bolton, if you will, conspired with others in the administration, like Pompeo, to thwart Trump's policy preferences on certainly on Russia. On China, less, I think a little less clear because there are so many cross-cutting cross currents at work. But I think, and you see it again in Bolton's book, that many of the people Trump appointed had either at the beginning or certainly by the end, contempt for Trump personally, for good reason, a belief that he was not serving the country, a belief that he was just serving Trump, and that even more, I think, that in other administrations, you had the feeling of the book, by the anonymous, that the way to protect real Republican values with a capital R and the national interest was to keep Trump under control. And, this is a recipe for a very incoherent policy. Now, in the end, we can make various judgments. We can make the moral judgment that these people should have resigned in protest, gone public, rather than engaged in sabotage. You can make the argument that they were, on the other hand, they sacrificed a lot of their own reputations by serving the country rather than serving the president. It was a very difficult situation. So I think there's a lot in there, first, that we don't know, and a lot of them, both dilemmas of political science to try to unravel, but also really deep ethical questions that I don't think the participants dealt with. Again, just from Bolton's book, I doubt if we'll get a book worth reading from Pompeo. I'm not sure that they thought about those issues, but I think we need to.
Okay. All right, so here's a war inevitability question. In respect with United States' geopolitical nightmare, the question is war with China inevitable, or are we already in sort of a war due to the actual cyber attacks or cyber warfare and hacking?
No, I think a war with China is extremely unlikely because it would prevent China from achieving its goal, which is, the global leadership. The Chinese are pursuing an economic strategy, not a military one. And I think there might be some skirmishes, maritime skirmishes, ships crashing into each other, in the South China Sea, but there's not going to be a war. And I don't really think that the cyber warfare is completely analogous to military attacks because, nobody dies and we've got various ways of defending each other. So it's not really a war.
I agree. I think the rhetoric of Sino-American conflict is greatly inflated, especially within the Beltway. And I think there's an enormous difference between the tone in Washington and in the rest of the country, looking at the academic experts. Now, the academic experts can be wrong. I don't want to make the claim that they're right in Washington is wrong, but there's a real difference in tone. In the good old days before COVID trapped us, you crossed the line in the Beltway, you could tell the difference. I don't think that has changed in the past. year. But I agree completely with Debbie. A war is, first nuclear war, unthinkable for both sides. High economic conflict ruins the Chinese economy and perhaps destabilizes the Chinese domestic system. And of course, harms the US, not as much, but certainly does great harm. China gains enormously from the established rules of the game. May want to change some of them, but I think its leaders understand how much it gains from the general prevailing system. I also agree with Debbie that there are danger spots. And she mentioned ships. In the nasty Cold War, we obviously fought wars, Korea and Vietnam, but the real dividing line was in Europe, in Germany. And there were great dangers, especially in Berlin, but land forces are much easier to control than ships. Ships' captains are very autonomous. Tactically, there are great advantages to striking first in any engagement between ships. Lots of things can go wrong. So the dangers of skirmishes when you're at sea are much greater. They don't automatically escalate to all-out war. I don't think they would, but they can lead to some quite nasty situations. But Debbie makes the basic point. No, certainly not inevitable. The talk of inevitability, I think, is misguided, and if it were generally believed, could be harmful. But I think it's partly a reflection of maybe a sort of need for enemies. The world, people say, oh, new Cold War, worse than the Cold War. Well, those people are young. Yeah. The three of us can remember the Cold War. No, that was a lot worse.
Okay, I've got two last questions now, and one's a follow-up to the previous one. If China and Russia are preparing to limit American influence by consolidating their sphere of influence, to what extent are they already succeeding, or not?
What, China, Russia consolidating their influence, their sphere of influence?
Limiting. They want to limit American influence by consolidating their sphere of influence. That's the way the question's phrased.
Well, I don't think either one of them is succeeding. In Southeast Asia, the smaller countries are hedging. They're refusing to side with either China or the United States, and they can play China and the U.S. off against each other and avoid being subordinate to China. So there's still a lot of independence on most of the countries in Southeast Asia. For example, Vietnam is willing to cooperate with the US militarily, and Singapore. So I just don't see that working because they have alternatives. In the case of Russia, they've got some minor influence over the EU, some countries and so forth, but still they're pretty much isolated. So I don't think they're succeeding, and especially not that we have a president who's internationalist. Now, if we had another 4 years of Trump where we were withdrawing from activity, then I think there would be a danger.
I agree completely. I think maybe part of American masochism, a feeling that our leaders, even Trump, are ninnies, and the other countries' leaders are geniuses, that the idea that Putin is a master strategist. His actions in Ukraine, in a way understandable to take the title of Debbie's article from Pique, what happened and when the EU deal was overturned and the EU didn't do anything to force it in a way that's Pique is understandable. But what did he do? He permanently alienated Ukraine. It's hard to imagine a situation in which Ukrainian public opinion becomes at all favorable to Russia for the next generation. And this was true despite the fact that, there was a lot of, before Putin took Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, there's a lot of fairly warm sentiment in Ukraine toward Russia. So Putin destroyed that. He then, by what he did, rallied Europe against him and created what Gorbachev realized the previous Soviet leaders had done. He created self-encirclement, that this wasn't going to happen had Putin played his cards right. And the bluff and bluster on these new weapons, which make, I think, they make a difference. If got friends in the Pentagon, yes, they have to deal with them, but they don't make a difference on the grand strategic level. So Putin has helped get himself reelected, but he has been terrible for Russian national interest. Xi overreached same way. Why? If he's going to antagonize Japan and press the US, why enrage Modi at the same time? If this is a grand strategy for limiting American influence, it's got some twists to it I don't understand. No, I think it's a mistake to think because American leaders and America makes various mistakes, or that the players on the other side are grand masters of the game. The ones we're dealing with are not.
Okay, so the last question, and so by way of comparison and contrast, and especially coming from some supporters of some of Trump's foreign policy, the comparison here is Trump's policy toward the Middle East, meaning Israel, Palestine. What can you say about that? This is a question I had for Deborah that I posed before the session, and one of the audience members posed it as well.
So the question is, what can we learn from Trump's policy towards the Middle East, or how does it fit in with his general approach?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, it fits very well. I mean, his personalization, his attempt to cultivate Saudi leaders. One of his first trip, I believe, was to Saudi Arabia. And the close ties between Jared Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman, but also his tolerance for Saudi activity that was really against U.S. interests, just to uphold his personal friendship. I mean, the covering up of the murder of Khashoggi, the tolerance for Saudi bombing of Yemen. I mean, clearly Trump placed his personal friendship ahead of U.S. national interest and the U.S. reputation for upholding liberal values, which made us look like a complete hypocrite. Now, you could say, yes, his relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, there were some peace agreements with the Emirates and so forth. But I think Netanyahu has basically led Trump around by the collar, and Trump has made all kinds of unilateral concessions to Bibi without getting anything in return.
I think
it's very similar.
I think that's true, but I admit the policy had, at least in some sense, worked better than I expected. There was less of a reaction to Trump's ratification of the Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, the severing of relations with the Palestinians. I did not favor those things at the time and can still debate them, but certainly they had fewer immediate negative consequences than I expected. It has created a new situation in the Middle East. And I don't think Trump could capitalize on it. The big question is, can the Biden administration and whatever administration emerges in Israel when they are through their serial elections, can you, in effect, use that to recognize some of the realities that I think the Palestinians for years refused to recognize? They refused to recognize that they were steadily losing support in the region. They were steadily losing relevance, that they had to accept things they were not willing to accept before. Can one use that to build some sort of semblance of a stable and more mutually acceptable relations? I'm not sure. I don't think Trump could do it, but I do think he may have provided some foundations that the Biden administration may be able to build on.
Well, I want to thank you both. We're 10 minutes over time. On behalf of PSQ and the Academy of Political Science, thanks very much in participating in our Academy Forum. I want to thank our audience as well. And please look for announcements in 3 months for our next quarterly forum. Thank you all again. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot, Deborah.
Yeah, thank you.